The sun hung lazily in the sky that afternoon, casting a golden haze across the newly painted fences and quiet lawns of Maplewood Lane, a neighborhood known for its calm streets, manicured yards, and the kind of silence that people paid extra for. The breeze was light, just enough to rustle the leaves of the sycamore trees that lined the sidewalks. Birds chirped softly in the distance. It was a peaceful scene, like something out of a picture book, until the air was split by the sharp echo of a bouncing basketball. It wasn't loud or disruptive, just the rhythmic thump of a young boy practicing his dribble in his driveway, completely absorbed in his game. That boy was 12-year-old Ethan Carter, slender, bright-eyed, wearing a worn blue hoodie and sneakers that had clearly seen a few miles. He was new to the neighborhood, having moved in only 2 weeks earlier with his mother. They were still settling in. Their boxes hadn't all been unpacked yet, and the welcome from the neighbors had been lukewarm at best, polite waves, hesitant smiles, and quick glances through curtains. Ethan didn't seem to mind. He found comfort in the sound of the ball hitting the pavement, in imagining buzzer-beater shots, in pretending he was on a team where no one cared what zip code he came from. That day, the ball bounced wrong. It hit the edge of the driveway and rolled away, escaping the safe bounds of his home. Ethan chased after it, laughing as he ran across the street. The ball came to rest near the edge of a neatly trimmed lawn that belonged to one of the older houses across from his. He stopped a few feet away, standing on the curb, peering toward the house. The yard was empty. The windows were closed. There were flower pots arranged in tidy rows and a flag fluttering lightly by the porch. He called out, "Excuse me, my ball's here." His voice was polite, cautious even. He didn't want to trespass. He didn't want to upset anyone. But no one answered. He waited a few more seconds, eyes scanning for movement. Still nothing. He sighed, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. Then slowly, he stepped 1 foot onto the lawn, then the other, and walked the short distance to retrieve his ball. What Ethan didn't know was that someone was watching, someone who saw his simple act not as innocent, but as something far more sinister. Behind one of those closed windows stood Karen Thompson, arms crossed, jaw clenched, her eyes locked on the boy like he was a threat. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and took pride in knowing exactly who came and went. She liked things a certain way, quiet, orderly, familiar. And to her, Ethan was none of those things. She had seen him a few times since he moved in, bouncing that basketball, walking to the corner store, waving awkwardly at passing neighbors. She hadn't introduced herself. She hadn't welcomed him. And in her mind, that distance meant she had reason to be wary. So when she saw Ethan step onto her lawn, she didn't consider that he was just a child retrieving a toy. She didn't think about calling out to him, asking what he was doing. She didn't give him the benefit of the doubt. Instead, she reached for her phone and dialed with swift purpose. The dispatcher picked up, calm and professional, but Karen's voice was sharp. "There's a black kid in my yard," she said flatly. "He's up to something. He's been snooping around, and I don't feel safe." Her eyes narrowed as she watched Ethan pick up the ball. "He looks suspicious. Send someone, please, right away." The call ended, but Karen didn't look away. She stayed at the window, watching as Ethan turned to walk back toward his house, basketball tucked under his arm, unaware of what had just been set in motion. Minutes later, a distant siren pierced the peaceful air, then another and another. The neighborhood's usual quiet was suddenly overpowered by the sound of sirens growing louder with each second. Doors opened, curtains twitched. People stepped out onto their porches to see what was happening. The red and blue lights flashed against the white siding of the houses as a police cruiser came to a stop near the house. Ethan froze mid-step, confused. The sirens were for him? The officers stepped out with the slow, deliberate movements of people responding to a call they were told to take seriously. Their expressions were unreadable. Their hands rested near their belts. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest as he clutched his ball tighter, his gaze darting between them. "What are you doing here, son?" one of the officers asked, his voice calm but firm. Ethan's lips parted, but the words caught. He didn't understand what was happening. I was just getting my ball," he finally managed to say. The officer raised an eyebrow. Before he could respond, Karen stepped out of her house with a look of righteous indignation painted across her face. "That's him," she said, pointing. "He's been snooping around here all day. I don't care what he says. He doesn't belong here." Her voice rang out clearly, and neighbors began to inch closer, drawn by the scene. Ethan turned his head, stunned. He stared at her, unable to understand how this had escalated so quickly. He tried to speak, to explain, but Karen kept going. "This is how it starts," she said, folding her arms. "They pretend they're just passing through, just retrieving something, but they're checking out the place, seeing what they can get into." She glanced at the officers, expecting agreement. "I know what I saw." The officers shifted uncomfortably. One turned back to Ethan. "Is that true? Were you trespassing?" Ethan looked down at his basketball. "No, sir," he whispered. "I wasn't trespassing. My ball rolled into her yard." His voice trembled, barely louder than the breeze. The officers hesitated. They didn't know what to make of it. It was a simple situation, yet they had been called, and there was a complainant insisting something was wrong. Karen's face remained tight with judgment. Her words had weight, not because they were true, but because they were spoken with certainty. Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to disappear. Around him, he could feel the eyes, neighbors peeking from porches, watching from windows, silently passing judgment. He felt like every eye was waiting for him to say the wrong thing, to make one wrong move that would justify all of this. "Why didn't you stay in your own yard?" one officer asked. Ethan blinked. It was such a simple question, but it felt like an accusation, a verdict. Karen's arms remained crossed. Her mouth curled in satisfaction. "See?" she said to the officers. I told you he was up to something. They always are." Her words cut deep, each syllable laced with something venomous. The officers glanced at each other again, stuck between protocol and pressure. Finally, one of them spoke. "We'll need to take him down to the station, just to ask a few questions." Ethan's head snapped up. "Am I in trouble?" he asked, his voice small. No, the officer said quickly. "We just need to sort things out." Ethan didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He simply nodded and followed their instructions, but just before they guided him toward the car, he turned to them and said softly, "Can I call my mum?" One of the officers handed him a phone. His hands shook as he dialed. Each ring felt like a lifetime. And then, finally, she answered. "Mom," he said, "something happened." Lisa Carter, governor of the state, froze the moment she heard her son's voice tremble through the receiver. She didn't need all the details. She didn't ask many questions. The fear in his voice told her everything she needed to know. Her staff watched as she rose from her chair and began making calls with the calm intensity of someone used to getting things done and not wasting a second. Within minutes, her convoy was moving, black SUVs weaving through traffic, their lights blazing through intersections as her security team cleared the path ahead. The peaceful quiet of the neighborhood that had only moments ago been broken by sirens was shattered all over again, this time not by a single patrol car, but by a full procession. As they neared the neighborhood, the convoy's presence turned heads. The deep rumble of the engines, the flashing lights, and the unmistakable air of authority caused a ripple of confusion and tension. Karen, who had remained near her porch with a self-satisfied air, turned toward the commotion. She squinted down the road, trying to make sense of the approaching vehicles. Her smug confidence began to falter. The crowd that had gathered widened, murmurs ran through it like electricity. "Who's coming? What's going on?" "That's the governor's convoy." The realization swept through the air like a gust of wind. Karen took a step back, her face twitching with uncertainty. She hadn't anticipated this. She thought this was a simple call about a boy in her yard. She thought she was doing the right thing. She hadn't imagined consequences. She hadn't imagined this. The lead vehicle came to a halt, and the door swung open. Out stepped Lisa Carter, not with rushed panic or angry shouts, but with the composed, commanding presence that had made her one of the most respected leaders in the country. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward the officers and her son. Her eyes scanned everything, the flashing lights, the tense faces, the silent crowd, and then finally, her son standing by the patrol car, his shoulders small, his basketball clutched tight against his chest. She didn't speak right away. The silence stretched. It was the kind of silence that made people uneasy, the kind that demanded answers without asking a single question. The officers straightened as she approached. The neighbors held their breath. And Karen, standing still near her front porch, suddenly felt a weight pressing down on her she hadn't expected, the weight of being seen, not as a victim, but as the cause. The moment Lisa Carter stepped out of the SUV, the atmosphere on the street changed. What had felt like a tense misunderstanding moments before now felt like something far more serious, something powerful, something historic. She didn't rush. She didn't yell. She simply walked, her posture tall and calm, her every step exuding a quiet authority that silenced the murmurs around her. The officers who had been questioning Ethan stood straighter, their nerves suddenly exposed under her steady gaze. The neighbors, who had lingered at the edge of their yards, unsure whether to return to their living rooms or lean in closer, now found themselves frozen in place, watching with wide eyes. Governor Lisa Carter wasn't just a politician. She was a presence. And now, standing in the very heart of the neighborhood where her son had been humiliated, she wasn't here in her official capacity. She wasn't here to shake hands or cut ribbons. She was here as a mother, as a woman whose 12-year-old child had been treated like a criminal for chasing after a basketball. The pain on Ethan's face when she looked at him made something inside her sharpen into steel. Her eyes briefly met his, and in that one look he knew he was safe, that she was here for him. And then her gaze shifted to the officers, who were clearly trying to decide whether to speak first or wait for her to say something. One of them cleared his throat. He was a tall man with thinning hair and a nervous edge that seemed to worsen with each second. "Governor Carter," he said carefully, trying to keep his tone respectful. "We didn't know. We were called here for a report of suspicious activity. A resident said there was someone on her property. We responded according to procedure." Lisa said nothing for a beat. She looked from him to his partner, then finally to Karen Thompson, who now stood rigid on her porch, her arms crossed tightly as if they could protect her from what was unfolding. Lisa's expression didn't change, but her silence pressed in like a storm cloud. When she finally spoke, her voice was level, but it carried a weight that no one dared interrupt. "And you didn't ask questions before involving my son in this?" The officer hesitated. "Ma'am, He's 12, Lisa said. Her eyes didn't blink, didn't falter. 12 years old. Did that matter to you? Did you look at him and see a child, or just a threat?" Karen spoke up suddenly, her voice trembling but still firm enough to be heard. "I didn't know who he was," she said. "I saw him walking into my yard and I panicked. I thought it was the right thing to do. I didn't recognize him. I didn't know he was your son." Lisa turned her head slowly, her gaze falling fully on Karen. She studied her with the quiet intensity of someone who had spent a career reading people, listening to the words they didn't say. "And if he weren't my son?" she asked softly. "If he were just some boy, someone else's child, would we be having this conversation right now, or would he be sitting in the back of a squad car?" Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. The confidence she'd carried earlier had drained from her face, replaced now with a pale tightness, a tension in her jaw that betrayed her embarrassment and rising fear. "I didn't mean," she started, but Lisa cut her off with a look that said enough had already been said. Lisa stepped forward, her hands still at her sides, her voice steady as steel. "You called the police," she said, "because a child went to retrieve his basketball. You didn't approach him. You didn't ask him who he was. You didn't wait to see what he was doing. You made a snap judgment based on how he looked, based on your own fear." Karen shook her head quickly. "I just saw someone in my yard and—" "No," Lisa said, her voice suddenly sharper, cutting through the air like a blade. "You saw a black child in your yard. That's the difference. You didn't just see a stranger, you saw danger where there was none." The street was silent. Not even a whisper moved through the gathered crowd. Lisa's words echoed, reverberating in the minds of those watching, exposing a truth many had felt but rarely said out loud. The officers stood frozen, their expressions tight, their eyes flicking between the governor and the woman who had called them there. No one moved, no one breathed too loudly. The moment was heavy, impossibly fragile, like the first crack in a wall that had stood untouched for years. Lisa finally turned back to her son. She walked over to him, gently knelt down so her eyes were level with his, and touched his arm. "You okay, baby?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded, but his lip trembled, and he blinked quickly to fight the tears that had been threatening since the sirens first arrived. "I just wanted my ball," he whispered. "I know," she said. "I know." Then she stood up, facing the officers once again. "This is Ethan Carter," she said, her voice regaining its edge. "My son. And I want to know, right now, what justification you have for detaining him." The officer hesitated, fumbled for words. "We didn't technically detain him, Governor. We were just trying to figure out what happened." The woman who called seemed very certain that... Lisa raised her hand slightly, and the officer fell silent. "And what evidence did she provide? Did you find anything that would suggest my son was doing anything other than getting his basketball? Did you see anything suspicious? Any behavior that warranted your presence here?" They shook their heads slowly, silently. The realization was settling in now. They had acted on a call without asking the right questions, without pausing to consider the context, without seeing the child in front of them as a child. Lisa turned back toward Karen, who had remained near her porch, her face now flushed with a deep, uncomfortable shade of shame. "So," Lisa said slowly, "a young boy walks into your yard, and instead of speaking to him, instead of treating him like a human being, you call the police. And now you're standing here trying to justify that decision with fear." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Lisa didn't give her the chance. "Let me be very clear. This wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice rooted in assumptions, in stereotypes, in the kind of thinking that continues to harm children like my son every single day." The weight of those words seemed to ripple outward, through the watching crowd, through the stunned officers, even through Karen, who looked as though she were shrinking under the weight of her own choices. Lisa's voice dropped lower, more intimate, yet somehow even more powerful. "Do you know how many parents of black children live with this fear every day? How many of us wonder what could happen if our child walks too far from home, if they reach into their pocket at the wrong moment, if they laugh too loud in the wrong place? You think this was about your yard? It wasn't. It was about control, about power, about you deciding who belongs and who doesn't." Karen's lips quivered. "I didn't mean any harm." "You didn't think you were doing harm," Lisa corrected. "But harm was done, not just to my son, but to every child watching this unfold, to every person who's ever been on the receiving end of a stare that says you don't belong. You think because it's subtle it doesn't hurt, because no one raised their voice that it doesn't matter." The officers were silent. The neighbors were still. Some of them began to glance at one another, ashamed, guilty, unsure what to say. A few stepped back, as though distance could somehow separate them from the truth they had witnessed. Lisa didn't demand apologies. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her calm, direct truth was more powerful than any outburst could have been. She stepped back from Karen and addressed the officers one last time. "This ends now. My son is going home, with me. You have no reason to continue this, and you never did." The officers both nodded, relieved perhaps that she wasn't pressing charges, but deeply unsettled by how clearly their own roles in this had been laid bare. They stepped back, allowing Ethan to walk freely to his mother's side. Karen watched him go, but something in her had changed. She was still standing, still breathing, but her certainty had crumbled. She had expected to be praised for her vigilance, not held accountable for her prejudice. She had thought she was protecting something, her property, her peace. But in truth, she had only exposed herself. Lisa placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and turned to the crowd. Her expression didn't invite applause or approval. It simply invited awareness. A mirror had been held up, and what the neighborhood saw staring back wasn't comfortable. But it was real, and it demanded to be reckoned with. The days that followed were anything but quiet on Maplewood Lane. The incident with Ethan Carter had left a mark, not just on the street where it happened, but on the entire community that had watched it unfold. People tried to go back to their routines, mowing their lawns, waving briefly to neighbors, watering flowers and walking their dogs. But something had changed. There was a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the tremor that comes before a storm. Neighbors who had once exchanged friendly small talk found their conversations trailing into silence when they passed by the Carter home. Others avoided eye contact altogether, ashamed or uncertain about where they stood. Children who had once played freely in the street now hesitated, glancing at the house with the flag where Karen Thompson had made the call. Something had ruptured, and everyone felt it, even if they didn't know what to do with it. Karen Thompson, once regarded as one of the most involved residents in the neighborhood association, began to feel a new kind of isolation creeping into her life. It started with the glances, the way people looked at her and then quickly looked away, the forced smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, the way conversations near her house died off the moment she stepped outside. At first, she tried to shrug it off. She told herself people were just busy, distracted, caught up in their own lives. But then the signs became harder to ignore. She noticed that the invitations she used to receive for block parties and potlucks stopped coming. When she entered the grocery store down the street, two women she'd known for years turned down a different aisle. Even the postman, who once greeted her with a cheerful wave, now simply nodded with a tight expression and moved on. Karen told herself it was unfair. She hadn't meant for things to go this far. She'd just seen a stranger, someone she didn't recognize, and acted. That's what anyone would do, right? But the problem was, the more she tried to justify it to herself, the more hollow her arguments felt. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she didn't see a concerned citizen anymore. She saw something else. She saw someone who had made a boy feel small, afraid, and alone, and it haunted her. Meanwhile, in the Carter household, things were also shifting. The initial shock of the event had settled into a heavy stillness, like dust that refused to be swept away. Lisa Carter tried to keep things normal for Ethan, making his favorite pancakes in the morning, helping with homework at night, even surprising him with a new basketball. But she could see it in his eyes. Something in him had dimmed. He still dribbled the ball in the driveway sometimes, but now he glanced up after every bounce, watching the houses, the windows, the shadows behind the curtains. He no longer called out friendly greetings to passing neighbors. He walked more slowly, smiled less. Lisa watched her son with a quiet ache in her chest. She had fought so many battles in her life, rising through a world that rarely made room for women like her, let alone welcomed them. She thought she'd protected him from the worst of it. But now she knew even the governor's son wasn't safe from suspicion. Still, Lisa wasn't the kind of woman to stay silent. She hadn't reached her position by accepting injustice with a polite nod. So she began making calls. Not angry demands for retribution, but strategic, purposeful outreach to the community association, the school board, local faith leaders, and anyone who had a stake in shaping the hearts and minds of the neighborhood. She didn't want revenge. She wanted reckoning. She wanted conversation. She wanted change. Within a week, Lisa proposed a series of town hall-style meetings, open forums where residents could come together to discuss race, implicit bias, community trust, and the experiences of families of color. She didn't just want people to attend, she wanted them to see, to understand, to reflect. There was pushback at first. Some residents claimed the issue was being blown out of proportion. Others insisted it was a one-time event, an unfortunate misunderstanding that didn't need to be dissected in public. But Lisa pressed forward, and slowly, voices began to rise in support. A local pastor volunteered to host the first session at the church. A teacher from the middle school offered to help moderate. Flyers were posted, emails were sent. And when the night of the first meeting arrived, the fellowship hall of the small brick church was packed. Ethan sat in the front row beside his mother, his fingers twisting nervously in his lap. He didn't know what to expect. He didn't know if people would stare at him, if they'd see him as a victim or a symbol or something else entirely, but what he saw instead surprised him. He saw neighbors, people who had seen what happened and had done nothing, now sitting quietly, listening. He saw the woman from the end of the street who always planted tulips in the spring raise her hand and say, "I didn't understand until now that not saying anything was part of the problem." He saw a man who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years stand up and admit, "I was raised to think colorblindness was enough. But I see now that pretending not to see race doesn't make the world any safer for your child." Lisa didn't speak first that night. She waited. She let others speak. She listened. When she finally rose, she told them not just about what had happened to Ethan, but about what had happened to her years earlier, when she was a young lawyer and was followed through a store by a security guard, or when she ran for city council and someone told her she didn't look like a leader. She connected the dots between then and now, between her experiences and her son's, between every look that questioned their presence and every voice that chose to stay silent. "We can't change the past," she said, "but we can face it, we can name it, and if we're brave enough, we can make sure it doesn't shape our future." From that night forward, things didn't transform overnight, but the wheels of change had started turning. The workshops continued, some small, others larger. Kids began talking about what they saw. Teachers brought new books into their classrooms. A mural was proposed for the local park, designed by students from the neighborhood, celebrating unity and inclusion. Ethan was invited to speak at his school assembly, a prospect that terrified him. But with his mother's gentle push, he agreed. He stood on the stage in front of hundreds of students and said, "When you see someone who looks different, don't just look at their skin, look at their heart, look at their story. Because I'm not just the boy who got the police called on him, I'm also the boy who wants to make the basketball team, the boy who loves math, the boy who likes corny jokes. I'm a person, just like you." His words were quiet, but they spread like ripples in a pond. Kids clapped, teachers cried. A boy from his class approached him afterward and said, "I didn't know you felt like that. I'm sorry." And it meant something. It didn't erase the hurt, but it mattered. It gave Ethan something to hold on to. Karen Thompson watched all of this unfold from the periphery. She hadn't attended the first meeting, or the second. She'd considered it, even dressed for it once, but then changed her mind and stayed home. But something about the way her world had changed, the way even her closest friends now kept their distance, forced her to look inward. The hardest part wasn't what others said to her, it was what she began to hear inside herself. The nagging truth she had tried to silence now spoke louder with every quiet dinner, every moment spent alone in her too-clean house. And so one night, weeks after the first forum, she showed up. She took a seat in the back, unnoticed at first, until the speaker pointed out that everyone there was part of the process. No names, no shaming, just presence, just listening. She didn't speak that night, nor the next. But eventually, at one session focused on accountability, she raised her hand. Her voice cracked when she spoke, and the room went still. "I thought I was protecting my home," she said, "but now I see that I was protecting an idea of safety that came at someone else's expense. I didn't see Ethan as a child. I saw a stranger, and I'm ashamed of that." She looked down, then up again, tears in her eyes. "I've spent weeks asking myself how I let fear replace empathy. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to do better." Some were skeptical, others nodded, but her words, like Ethan's, were a ripple, and those ripples mattered. Lisa Carter never once called Karen by name in her public addresses. She never humiliated her or turned her into a villain because she knew the real enemy wasn't a single woman. It was a mindset, a fear, a long-standing culture of suspicion toward people who looked like her son. And that kind of enemy wasn't defeated with revenge. It was confronted with truth, with dialogue, with the slow, patient work of transformation. And so the work continued. Schools added community history into their curriculum. The local police department agreed to participate in joint training sessions with civil rights organizations. A scholarship fund was started in Ethan's name for students who had overcome bias or adversity, and in the midst of it all, Ethan returned to his routine. He began playing in the driveway again, dribbling his ball with a little more confidence, a little more strength. Neighbors started waving back. One boy from down the street joined him, then another. And slowly, the image of Ethan standing beside a police car was replaced by another. Ethan laughing on the sidewalk, playing ball with friends. Lisa watched it all, quietly, knowing the work was far from done, but also knowing something had changed. Her son, her neighborhood, maybe even Karen. This story hadn't been easy. It had started with fear, it had exposed wounds, but it had also opened doors, and that, she knew, was how change truly begins. Not with perfection, but with the courage to face our flaws, speak our truths, and believe that we can be better.